And so in the same way with the actuarial tables of insurance companies. They will say the average lifespan of an adult male is 65 years. But on any individual case, these tables do not tell us when I am going to die. And so our critic, our Chinese critic might say, well, so you see, I myself am of a somewhat skeptical temperament, and I very much doubt, in fact, whether this way of coming at decisions really worked. Or, let us put it this way, we can never really prove whether any method of coming to decisions really works. I mean, I may make a foolish decision, and I call it foolish because as a result of it I get killed. But there's absolutely no way of showing that my getting killed at that moment didn't preserve me from a worse fate, from making mistakes that involved the lives of many other people. If I so-called succeed by making a right decision, and I earn $1 million, there's no way of showing that this isn't so bad for my character, that's the worst thing that could possibly happen. So we never really know whether the outcome of a decision is a failure or a success, not in the long run, because only the unknown, what comes next, will show whether it was good or bad, and the unknown stretches infinitely into the future. But it seems to me that the importance of this old Chinese book of divination is twofold. First of all, there's a bad side to it, a distinct disadvantage in Chinese culture. The Chinese came so much to rely on the Book of Changes and to use its system of symbols, those trigrams I showed you, to use these for classifying all natural phenomena, that in the course of time it became a very rigid thing, and it excluded the perception of novelty. Now the warning and the advantage to us in that is we can do the same thing with scientific method. There are certain kinds of personality who become very rigid in their scientific ideas and simply automatically exclude certain possibilities because they don't conform with alleged scientific dogma. Take, for example, what we call ESP, or extrasensory perception. I rather call it extraordinary sensory perception. But still, there is good reason to believe that there is extremely strong evidence for something of this kind occurring, and yet many scientific people will ignore that evidence because they say things like that simply can't happen. And that is to fall into the same rut that the Chinese fell into when they relied too meticulously upon the classification of the world and of events found in the Book of Changes. But there's a positive side to the picture, for this Book of Changes is founded on a view of life which is very suggestive to us, which is in accord with certain points of view that now develop in our own science. A way of life, a way of looking at life, which sees not so much the causal relationship between events as the pattern of events. Let me try and show that difference. When we think of causality, we think chiefly of the way events are determined by their past. It's as if events were a lot of marbles, and they're thrown together and they knock each other around. And therefore, in tracing the movement of any particular marble, we try to find out which other marbles knocked it, and so trace it back and back and back. And until quite recent times, the whole view of Western science was based on the idea of causality, how things are influenced by past things. But the point of view that underlies the Book of Changes, and that the Chinese never really applied to their science, they applied it rather to their art and perhaps their philosophy of law. But the point of view here is different. It is instead of understanding events by relation to past causes, it understands events by relation to their present pattern. And in other words, it comprehends them by taking a total view instead of what we might call a linear view. If, for example, we can find a suitable analogy for the Western way of looking at things, we might say it is understanding events in accordance with the order of words. For example, I can say, this dog has no bark, and then this tree has no bark. Now, the meaning of bark in these two sentences is determined by what went before them. I make sounds before I say the sound bark. Before I say bark, I say this dog has no. Now, if I want to know what bark means, I have to go back to what happened in the past. But if you take the order not of words, but what I would rather call the order of design, we get a rather different situation. Supposing I draw two small circles. And these correspond to the two words bark. They're both the same. But now, supposing a design arises around those two circles. And then at once we see that in their context, those two original circles have quite different meaning. But you see their relationship to their meaning all at once. I mean, imagine, supposing these designs had not been drawn by a brush, line after line after line, but had appeared all together at once as you see the image appear when you're developing a photographic plate. Then you would see that the meaning of each part of the design is relative to the rest of it as you see it now at this moment. And so in the same way, the fundamental philosophy of the Book of Changes and of the Chinese idea of the relationship between events is to understand every event in its present context. Not understanding it so much as we do by what went before it, but rather understanding it in terms of what goes with it. Thus, the idea of the Book of Changes is to reveal through its symbols the total pattern of the moment when the question is asked, on the supposition that the pattern of this moment governs even the tossing of the coins. Now then, the interesting comparison that arises out of this is that because we in the West have tended to understand events in accordance with the order of words, in accordance with the order of causality, we have evolved a conception of nature as based on law. In other words, when we ask for the explanation of any natural phenomenon, we look for that explanation in words, in a formulation that will describe a law. On the other hand, the Chinese have not evolved the idea of a law of nature, but something quite different, but equally valid and equally useful. There is indeed a word in Chinese for law, in very much our sense of law. It's a rather interesting word because as it was originally written, it was a picture like this. That's a picture of an iron cauldron, and beside it, a figure holding a knife. This is the Chinese word for law, TSE, Z, which most corresponds to our idea of law. And the reason for this symbol is that in ancient times, some of the old emperors commanded the laws to be written on the iron sacrificial cauldrons. And when the people came to offer sacrifice and put their offerings into the cauldrons, they could read the laws written upon the cauldrons. But at the time when those ancient emperors ordered the laws to be written in this way, there were certain sages and scholars who said, no, you shouldn't write the laws down, because if you write the laws down, the people will develop a litigious spirit. That is to say, they will start quibbling. And therefore, the property of the order of nature is sometimes called in Chinese not this. The expression wu, zi, wu meaning not, wu zi is used, meaning apparently lawless. But it doesn't really mean lawless. For example, if we go for a moment to Chinese ideas of civil law, a good judge does not base his decisions on this kind of law, written down law, because he knows that no written law can apply to all the complex multiplicity of circumstances that may arise. And so he bases his decisions on what the Chinese call not law, but justice. This word is pronounced I. And justice in this sense corresponds rather to our idea of equity. It is the sensibility for order and reasonableness that is embodied in an individual. He hasn't got it clearly written down, but he is the sort of person who is able to judge in any particular circumstance whether a certain decision is fair or not fair. And they much rather trust a man who has E in him than a man who has a thorough knowledge of the rules. And so we come thus to a conception of the order of nature that is one of the most important words in the Chinese language. And that is a word which originally meant the markings in jade, the grain in wood, or the fiber in muscle, and it's pronounced li. This is a character then, meaning really the basic fundamental pattern of things. But such an image is used as the markings in jade or the grain in wood, because this is an extremely subtle, complex pattern, a huge area of events all happening together at once, which has to be taken in at a glance, in the same way as we take design in at a glance, understood at a glance, and therefore is not capable of formulation in the order of words. And so li, meaning perhaps organic pattern, is the fundamental Chinese idea of the order of nature. In other words, when we think of beauty, we know very clearly what is beautiful and what isn't. But it's absolutely impossible to write down a set of laws and rules as to how one will create beautiful objects. In mathematics, for example, mathematicians often feel that certain equations, certain expressions are peculiarly beautiful. And mathematicians, because they are meticulous people, try to think out exactly why is this beautiful. Could we make up a rule for beauty? And yet they come to the conclusion that if we could make up a rule and apply it in mathematics, and always by the use of this rule get a beautiful result, eventually those results would cease to impress us as being beautiful. They would become sterile and dry. And so in the same way, the order of nature, the order of justice, the order of beauty are things which we can know in ourselves, but we cannot write down in black and white. And therefore, the superior man is one who has the sensibility for these things in himself.